The atmosphere inside the executive office of Forrester Creations was thick with an almost suffocating tension, a palpable manifestation of the bitter corporate warfare that had completely consumed the Los Angeles fashion industry. Steffy Forrester Finnegan stood behind her desk, her eyes blazing with an unyielding fury as she faced off against Hope Logan Spencer. The defection of Hope to Logan Creations, the sudden and aggressive launch of the Hope by Logan brand, and the relentless media frenzy surrounding the Logan merger had pushed Steffy to the absolute brink of her sanity. The two women, whose rivalry had spanned decades and generations, were locked in a vicious verbal spar. Steffy's voice echoed off the glass walls, accusing Hope of orchestrating a calculated attack on the Forrester legacy, of betraying the very family that had nurtured her career. Hope, newly empowered and refusing to back down, fired back with equal intensity, defending her autonomy and her right to step out from beneath the suffocating shadow of the Forrester empire. But as the argument reached a fever pitch, something inside Steffy simply gave way. The relentless, crushing pressure of the past few weeks, the catastrophic failure of Eric Forrester's haute couture show, the apocalyptic public relations nightmare, the terrifying realization that her marriage to John Finn Finnegan was hanging by a mere thread, and the suffocating weight of a dark, unspeakable secret suddenly crashed down upon her all at once. Mid-sentence, the vibrant color violently drained from Steffy's face. The fierce fire in her eyes was instantly replaced by a hollow, glassy stare. She reached out, her trembling fingers desperately seeking the edge of the mahogany desk for support, but her strength completely evaporated. With a sharp gasp that silenced the room, Steffy collapsed, her body crumpling to the floor in a terrifying display of physical and emotional exhaustion. The fierce corporate warrior had finally been broken, her consciousness fading into darkness as Hope's triumphant defiance instantly morphed into sheer, unadulterated panic. The frantic ambulance ride to the hospital was a blur of blaring sirens and flashing red lights cutting through the bustling streets of Los Angeles. When the emergency call reached John Finn Finnegan, the brilliant doctor felt his heart completely drop into his stomach. The sterile, brightly lit corridors of the hospital, usually a place where Finn commanded authority and saved lives, suddenly felt like a terrifying labyrinth of impending doom. He sprinted through the hallways, his medical mind racing with 1,000 horrifying possibilities. Was it a heart attack? A stroke? The physical manifestation of the severe post-traumatic stress disorder she had been battling ever since Sheila Carter's reign of terror. Finn's conscience was already heavily burdened with a suffocating guilt. He knew that his catastrophic decision to hide Sheila's presence on his commercial flight to Monaco had shattered Steffy's sense of safety, driving her away and fracturing their once unbreakable bond. As he burst through the double doors of the emergency department, Finn desperately prayed to whatever higher power would listen that this medical emergency would not take his beloved wife away from him. Pacing outside the hospital room, Finn was a portrait of a man entirely consumed by anxiety. The minutes stretched into agonizing hours. When the attending physician finally emerged from the room, Finn braced himself for the absolute worst. He expected a diagnosis of severe fatigue, extreme dehydration, or perhaps a cardiovascular event brought on by the immense stress of the Forrester and Logan corporate war. Instead, the doctor offered a warm, reassuring smile that completely contrasted with the grim atmosphere. The diagnosis was not a life-threatening illness or a permanent physical breakdown. The extreme exhaustion, the sudden fainting spell, the emotional volatility, it was all the result of a miraculous, unexpected development. Steffy Forrester Finnegan was pregnant. And not just with one child, but with twins. For a fleeting, beautiful moment, the entire world seemed to stop spinning for John Finnegan. The crushing weight of the Monaco disaster, the terrifying presence of Sheila Carter, the endless corporate battles, all of it evaporated into the sterile hospital air. A wave of euphoric, overwhelming happiness washed over him, bringing tears of pure joy to his eyes. Twins, to new lives, two beautiful additions to their family. Finn immediately envisioned a future filled with laughter, picturing Kelly and Hayes running around the Cliff House with two new siblings. In his desperate, hopeful mind, this miraculous pregnancy was the ultimate salvation for their struggling marriage. It was a divine intervention, a beautiful blessing that would finally wash away the darkness of the past few months and bind them together for the rest of their lives. With his heart soaring and a radiant smile illuminating his face, Finn practically floated into Steffy's hospital room, ready to embrace his wife and celebrate the incredible future that awaited them. Steffy was sitting upright in the hospital bed, the stark white sheets contrasting sharply with her pale, tear-stained face. As Finn rushed to her bedside, overflowing with words of love, adoration, and boundless excitement about the twins, he reached out to pull her into a passionate embrace. But the reaction he received was not one of shared joy or relieved tears. It was a reaction of sheer, paralyzing horror. As Finn leaned in, Steffy violently recoiled, her hands flying up to push him away with a desperate, frantic energy. The physical rejection was so sudden, so visceral, that it physically knocked the breath out of Finn's lungs. His radiant smile vanished instantly, replaced by a profound, agonizing confusion. He looked at his wife, expecting to see the radiant glow of an expectant mother, but instead he saw a woman drowning in an ocean of suffocating guilt and absolute despair. Steffi's chest heaved as she hyperventilated, her hands covering her face as she broke down into uncontrollable, gut-wrenching sobs. The sterile walls of the hospital room seemed to close in on her, trapping her in a nightmare of her own making. She could not let him believe the lie. She could not look into the eyes of the man who had taken a bullet for her, the man who loved her with every fiber of his being, and allow him to celebrate a miracle that did not belong to him. The agonizing silence in the room was only broken by the sound of Steffy's shattered weeping. Finn stood frozen, his medical mind desperately trying to rationalize her reaction. Was it the hormones? Was she terrified of bringing more children into a world where Sheila Carter still roamed free? He gently reached out again, his voice trembling as he softly asked her what was wrong, begging her to let him in, to let him comfort her. But there was no comfort to be found in the devastating truth. Slowly, agonizingly, Steffy lowered her hands from her face. Her eyes, red and swollen with tears, locked onto Finn's confused gaze. The words she spoke next were barely a whisper, yet they struck with the destructive force of a nuclear bomb. She choked on her own breath as she forced the confession past her lips, admitting the horrifying reality that the twins growing inside her womb were not his. The declaration hung in the air, a chilling, impossible sentence that completely defied Finn's comprehension. For a moment, his brain simply refused to process the information. He shook his head, a nervous, disbelieving laugh escaping his lips as he tried to dismiss her words as a symptom of stress or exhaustion. But the sheer, unadulterated agony in Steffy's eyes confirmed the catastrophic reality. He had not touched her in that intimate way since before the disastrous trip to Monaco. The biological timeline was an undeniable truth. As Finn stood paralyzed by the shock, Steffy's confession poured out of her in a torrent of shame and heartbreak. She transported him back to that fateful, tragic night following the explosive confrontation on the Monaco beach. She recounted how she had discovered his unforgivable secret that he had known Sheila Carter was on his commercial flight and had deliberately hidden it from her. She described the blinding rage, the feeling of utter betrayal, the moment she had hurled her wedding ring at his chest and fled back to Los Angeles on a commercial flight. She painted a vivid, horrifying picture of her arrival at the Forrester Creations CEO office, a woman completely broken by trauma and seeking refuge in the bottom of a liquor bottle. She was drowning in the pain of a shattered marriage, seeking any escape from the terrifying reality that her husband, was still emotionally tethered to the psychopathic woman who had nearly murdered them both in that dark alleyway. And then she revealed the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. She was not alone in the CEO office that night. Carter Walton had joined her. Carter, a man who was drowning in his own profound, suffocating grief. He had just received the utterly devastating news that his beloved wife, Daphne Rose Walton, had been diagnosed with severe infertility and early menopause by Dr. Lee Finnegan. Believing she was holding Carter back from his lifelong dream of having a family, Daphne had tragically packed her bags and moved to Paris, leaving Carter completely shattered and alone. Bonded by their mirrored devastation, their shattered marriages, and the heavy, intoxicating influence of alcohol, Steffy and Carter had sought comfort in the darkest moment of their lives. In a state of vulnerable, drunken vengeance, they had crossed the ultimate line, engaging in a passionate, steamy affair right there on the executive desk of Forrester Creations. They had made a desperate, solemn pact to keep the encounter a secret forever, vowing to bury their indiscretion to prevent the complete destruction of their respective lives. As the horrifying details of the confession washed over him, John Finnegan physically stumbled backward as if he had been struck by a physical blow to the chest. The brilliant, compassionate doctor was completely and utterly shattered. The betrayal ripped through his soul, leaving behind a trail of unimaginable devastation. He had survived a gunshot wound to the chest. He had survived the psychological torture of being held captive by his deranged biological mother. He had fought tooth and nail to protect his family and redeem himself in Steffy's eyes. But this betrayal from the woman he loved more than life itself was a pain far more excruciating than any physical injury. It was a betrayal far more painful, far more insidious than any of Sheila Carter's dark, manipulative tricks. Sheila was a known monster, an external threat that they could fight together. But Steffy was his heart, his safe harbor, his entire world. And she had taken his trust, his love, and his devotion, and shattered it into a million irreparable pieces in the arms of another man. The agonizing irony of the situation was almost too much to bear. Carter Walton, a man who had spent his entire adult life desperately yearning for a child of his own, a man whose marriage to Daphne was currently hanging in the balance due to her heartbreaking inability to conceive, was now the biological father of twins, and the mother of those twins was the wife of Carter's close friend and colleague. The revelation was a ticking time bomb that threatened to obliterate not just the Finnegan family, but the Walton marriage as well. Daphne had recently realized the massive error of her ways, returning from Paris to Los Angeles, fully prepared to fight for her marriage and explore alternative paths to parenthood with the man she loved. She was completely oblivious to the fact that her husband had committed the ultimate betrayal and that his indiscretion had resulted in the very miracle she could not provide. When the truth inevitably surfaced, the collateral damage would be catastrophic, destroying multiple families and leaving a trail of broken hearts in its wake. Standing in the sterile, cold environment of the emergency room, Finn looked at the woman he had vowed to cherish for the rest of his life, and he saw a stranger. The beautiful, perfect dream of their family, the cliff house filled with laughter, the unbreakable bond they had forged through fire and blood was completely reduced to ashes. The joyous announcement of the twins, which only moments ago had represented the ultimate salvation of their love, had transformed into the final, fatal nail in the coffin of the sin marriage. The corporate war raging outside the hospital walls, the bitter feuds between the Forresters, the Spencers, and the Logans, all seemed entirely insignificant compared to the nuclear explosion that had just decimated their personal lives. As Steffi continued to weep, her pleas for forgiveness falling on deaf ears, Finn turned his back and slowly walked out of the hospital room, leaving behind the shattered remains of a love story that had tragically, irreversibly come to an end. Let us delve deeper into the psychological torment that gripped John Finnegan as he wandered aimlessly through the sterile, echoing corridors of the Los Angeles hospital. Every step he took felt like he was wading through thick, suffocating concrete. His mind, usually sharp and capable of diagnosing the most complex medical anomalies, was completely short-circuiting under the immense weight of Steffy's confession. He found himself mentally replaying the events of the past few weeks, desperately searching for the warning signs he had somehow missed. He remembered the coldness in Steffy's eyes when she returned from her self-imposed exile at Forrester Creations. He remembered the way she would flinch slightly whenever he tried to initiate physical intimacy, blaming her distance on the relentless stress of the corporate war with Logan Creations and the lingering trauma of Sheila's presence in Monaco. He had foolishly, blindly believed her excuses, attributing her emotional withdrawal to the pressures of being a CEO and a protective mother. Never in his darkest, most paranoid nightmares could he have imagined that her distance was born from the suffocating guilt of carrying another man's children. The image of Carter Walton continuously flashed in Finn's mind, a cruel, mocking specter that twisted the knife deeper into his bleeding heart. Carter was a man universally respected within their inner circle, a pillar of moral integrity, the trusted chief operating officer of Forrester Creations, and a man who had officiated weddings and offered counsel to them all. To know that this man, this trusted friend and colleague, had taken advantage of a vulnerable, intoxicated Steffy in her darkest hour was a pill too bitter to swallow. Finn felt a surge of violent, uncharacteristic rage boiling beneath his skin. He wanted to march into the Forrester building, grab Carter by the collar of his impeccably tailored suit, and demand to know how he could commit such an atrocious act of betrayal. Carter knew how much Finn loved Steffy. Carter knew the immense trauma they had endured at the hands of Sheila Carter. Yet, in a moment of shared grief and alcohol-fueled weakness, Carter had callously disregarded all of that, prioritizing his own pain and desires over the sanctity of the Finnegan marriage. Back inside the hospital room, Steffy was drowning in a dark, bottomless abyss of self-hatred and despair. The monitors beside her bed beeped in a steady, monotonous rhythm, a stark contrast to the chaotic, violent storm raging within her soul. She wrapped her arms protectively around her abdomen, a subconscious gesture of maternal instinct, even as her mind recoiled from the reality of the two lives growing inside her. These twins were the physical embodiment of her greatest mistake, a permanent, living testament to the night she had allowed her trauma and her thirst for vengeance to override her vows. She thought about her daughter, Kelly, and her son, Hayes. How would she ever explain this to them? How could she look into their innocent eyes and tell them that their family had been destroyed not by a psychopathic villain with a gun, but by their own mother's catastrophic lack of judgment? The legacy of the Forrester women, fraught with scandalous affairs and paternity mysteries, had always been a shadow she desperately fought to escape. She had prided herself on being different, on building a stable, loyal, and unbreakable family unit. Now she had repeated the very cycle of destruction she had sworn to avoid, cementing her place in the long, tragic history of Forrester family scandals. The ripple effects of this devastating revelation were bound to be catastrophic, stretching far beyond the walls of the hospital and sending shockwaves through the entire Los Angeles fashion industry. At Forrester Creations, the atmosphere was already incredibly volatile. Ridge Forrester, Steffy's fiercely protective father, had declared an all-out, scorched-earth war on the Spencer family and Logan Creations. He was currently consumed by a volcanic rage over Hope Logan's defection and the violent altercation between Will Spencer and R.J. Forrester. When Ridge inevitably discovered that his beloved daughter's marriage had been destroyed by his most trusted executive, Carter Walton, the fallout would be apocalyptic. Ridge's temper, already operating on a hair trigger, would undoubtedly explode, potentially leading to Carter's immediate termination and exile from the company he had helped build. The internal stability of Forrester Creations, already severely compromised by the ongoing corporate warfare, would completely collapse. leaving the iconic fashion house vulnerable to the aggressive, calculated maneuvers of Bill Spencer and Katie Logan. Furthermore, the tragic irony of Carter and Daphne's situation added a layer of profound, Shakespearean tragedy to the unfolding drama. Daphne Rose Walton had returned from Paris with a renewed sense of hope and a fierce determination to save her marriage. She had spent weeks agonizing over her severe infertility and early menopause diagnosis, convinced that her inability to provide Carter with a biological child made her unworthy of his love. But she had realized that their love was worth fighting for, that they could explore adoption, surrogacy, or other alternative paths to parenthood. She had stepped off the plane in Los Angeles ready to embrace her husband and rebuild their future together. How would she survive the horrifying realization that during her brief absence, her husband had fathered twins with her close friend? The sheer cruelty of the universe, granting Carter the biological children he so desperately craved through an act of ultimate betrayal, would undoubtedly break Daphne's spirit entirely. The psychological devastation would be absolute, permanently destroying any chance of reconciliation, and leaving Daphne to pick up the shattered pieces of her life in the wake of a scandal she never saw coming. As the sun began to set over the sprawling metropolis of Los Angeles, casting long, dramatic shadows across the city skyline, the lives of these interconnected families were forever altered. Hope Logan Spencer, still unaware of the tragedy unfolding at the hospital, continued to celebrate the massive success of her new fashion line at Logan Creations, completely oblivious to the fact that her fierce corporate rival had just lost everything that truly mattered. Brooke Logan Forrester, consumed by her own maternal fury and bitter resentment over the family feuds, remained fixated on her vendettas, blind to the genuine, soul-crushing heartbreak that had just decimated her stepdaughter's life. The glamorous, high-stakes world of high fashion, with its dazzling runway shows, multi-million-dollar diamond deals, and ruthless corporate takeovers, suddenly seemed entirely trivial and meaningless in the face of such profound human suffering.